Education in Ethiopia has been dominated by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for many centuries until secular education was adopted in the early 1900s. Prior to 1974, Ethiopia had an estimated illiteracy rate well above 90% and compared poorly with the rest of Africa in the provision of schools and universities. After 1974 revolution, emphasis was placed on increasing literacy in rural areas. Practical subjects were stressed, as was the teaching of socialism. Recently, there has been massive expansion throughout the educational system. Primary school education consists of 2 cycles from grades 1 to 4 and grades 5 to 8. Secondary schools have 2 cycles from grades 9 to 10 and grades 11 to 12. Primary schools have over 90% of 7-year-olds enrolled, although only about half complete the 2 cycles. A much smaller proportion of children attend secondary school and even fewer attend the second cycle. School attendance is lowest in rural areas due to lack of provision and alternative occupations. The school curriculum in later years covers more subjects at a higher level than curricula in most other countries. Low pay and undervaluation of teachers contributes to poor quality teaching. This is exacerbated by large class sizes and poor resources, resulting in poor performance on national assessments. There is evidence of corruption, including forgery of certificates. Many primary schools have introduced mother tongue teaching, but there have been difficulties where small minority languages are concerned. English medium instruction remains a problem throughout the later years of education. Girls' access to education has been improved, but early marriage decreases their attendance. Girls' educational attainment is adversely affected by gender stereotypes, violence, lack of sanitary facilities and the consequences of sexual activity. Jimma University is addressing some problems women experience in higher education. TVETs have introduced competence-based assessments, although many lack adequate resources. Teacher training has been upgraded. All higher education has been expanding, but this has not been accompanied by sufficient expansion in staffing and resources. There have been difficulties in introducing BPR, with poorly paid university staff supplementing their incomes where possible. Universities need to match training to market demands. All colleges and universities suffer from the same disadvantages as schools. Library facilities are poor, classes are large and there is lack of equipment. Pre-1900 history. Although the existence of inscriptions prove that literacy preceded the adoption of Christianity as the recognized religion in Ethiopia, by the time of the earliest surviving records, formal education was controlled by the church. Educational opportunities were seen as the preserve of Ethiopia's ruling Amhara class. However, these efforts provided educational opportunities to only a few. Samuel Gobert estimated that, where Amharic is spoken, about 1/5 of the male population can read a little, and in Tigray about 1/12. According to Richard Pankhurst, the traditional education provided by the church began with the learning of the alphabet, or more properly, syllabary, made up of 26 base characters, each with 7 forms, indicating the various vowels. The student's second stage comprised the memorization of the first chapter of the first epistle general of St. John in Gs. The study of writing would probably also begin at this time, and particularly in more modern times some arithmetic might be added. In the third stage the Acts of the Apostles were studied, while certain prayers were also learnt, and writing and arithmetic continued. The children, who also studied signing, would now be able to serve as choristers. The fourth stage began with the study of the Psalms of David and was considered an important landmark in a child's education, being celebrated by the parents by a feast in which the teacher, father confessor, relatives and neighbors were invited. A boy who had reached this stage would moreover usually be able to write, and might act as a letter writer. Other work in this stage included the study of praises to God, and the Virgin Mary, the Song of Solomon and the Songs of the Prophets. Many people have learned the Song of Solomon. The higher education the Ethiopian church provided involved church music, poetry, mathematics, history, philosophy and manuscript writing. Another field of study was aquaquam, or the religious dance performed as part of church services. 1900s history. Until the early 1900s, formal education was confined to a system of religious instruction organized and presented under the aegis of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Church schools prepared individuals for the clergy and for other religious duties and positions. In the process, these schools also provided religious education to the children of the nobility and to the sons of limited numbers of tenant farmers and servants associated with elite families. Such schools mainly served the Amhara and Tigray inhabitants of the Ethiopian highlands. Misguided policies caused very few children to receive an education. As a result, Ethiopia did not meet the educational standards of other African countries in the early 1900s. Toward the end of the 19th century, Menelik II had also permitted the establishment of European missionary schools. At the same time, Islamic schools provided some education for a small part of the Muslim population. At the beginning of the 20th century, the education system's failure to meet the needs of people involved in statecraft, diplomacy, commerce, and industry led to the introduction of government-sponsored secular education. The first public school to provide a Western-style education was the École Impériale Menelik II, which was opened in October 1908 under the guidance of Hannah Salib and a number of Copt teachers. By 1924, Pankhurst notes that no fewer than 3,000 students had passed through the school, and states that in 1935 the school had 150 pupils. That same year, Emperor Menelik II established a primary school in Hara. In 1925, the government adopted a plan to expand secular education. But 10 years later there were only 8,000 students enrolled in 20 public schools. A few students also studied abroad on government scholarships. Pankhurst provides minimum numbers for several countries. At least 20 studied in Lebanon, 19 in Egypt, 12 in Sudan, 63 in France, 25 in England, 8 in the United States, 10 in Switzerland, 10 in Italy, and smaller numbers in Germany, Belgium and Spain. After their conquest of Ethiopia, the Italians acted quickly to reorganize the educational system in Ethiopia. An ordinance issued 24 July 1936 reiterated the principle that the newly conquered country, as in the older colonies, would have two different types of educational institutions, namely, Italian-type schools, and schools for colonial subjects. The existing Tafari Makonnen School was converted into two Italian-type schools. The Liceo Ginnasio Vittorio Emanuele III and the Istituto Tecnico Benito Mussolini, both reserved for European children, while the pre-war Empress Menen School for girls was converted into the Regina Elena Military Hospital. Many other existing schools were converted to Italian-only schools, while new schools created for the native population, in the words of Patrick Roberts, were not schools in reality, but have been established for propaganda purposes, although the Italian government boasted in 1939 that there were 13 primary schools in the province of Shewa staffed by over 60 teachers and having an enrollment of 1481. Actual attendance fluctuated greatly, as the official statement admitted that many students were said to be absent from class in order to follow Italian lorries, or to spend their time idly in their tukals. Following the Italian defeat, the country started to build up this sector, but the system faced shortages of teachers, textbooks, and facilities. The government recruited foreign teachers for primary and secondary schools to offset the teacher shortage. By 1952, a total of 60,000 students were enrolled in 400 primary schools, 11 secondary schools, and 3 institutions offering college-level courses. In the 1960s, 310 mission and privately operated schools with an enrollment of 52,000 supplemented the country's public school system. While reforms have been made in the aims of education, the actual structure of the Ethiopian school system has remained unchanged from that established in the 1950s. In May 1961, Ethiopia hosted the United Nations-sponsored Conference of African States on the Development of Education. Among other things, the conference highlighted Ethiopia's educational deficiencies. The Ethiopian education system, especially in primary and secondary education, was ranked the bottom among African nations. There were school and teacher shortages, a high dropout rate, and low overall attendance rates, especially among females, non-Christians and rural children. Embarrassed by this record, the Ministry of Education developed a new education policy, which was in effect until 1974. Designed in conjunction with the objectives of the government's second and third five-year development plans, extending from 1962 to 1973. The policy gave precedence to the establishment of technical training schools, although academic education also was expanded. Curriculum revisions introduced a mix of academic and non-academic subjects. But Amharic became the language of instruction for the entire primary cycle, which handicapped any child who had a different primary language. There were two institutions of higher education: Haile Selassie University in Addis Ababa, formed by imperial charter in 1961, and the private University of Izmara, founded by a Roman Catholic religious order based in Italy. The government expanded the public school system, and in 1971 there were 1,300 primary and secondary schools and 13,000 teachers. But the system suffered from a shortage of qualified personnel, a lack of funds, and overcrowded facilities. Often financed with foreign aid, school construction usually proceeded faster than the training and certification of teachers. In addition, most schools were in the major towns. Crowded and understaffed, those schools in small towns and rural areas provided a poor education. The inadequacies of public education before the mid-1970s resulted partly from the school financing system. To finance primary education, the government levied a special tax on agricultural land. Local boards of education supervised the disbursement of tax receipts. The system's inequities fostered the expansion of primary education in wealthier regions rather than in poorer ones. Moreover, urban inhabitants, who did not have to pay the tax but who were predominantly represented in the schools, sent their children at the expense of the tax-paying rural landowners and poor peasants. The government attempted to rectify this imbalance in 1970 by imposing an education tax on urban landowners and a 2% tax on the personal income of urban residents. But the Ministry of Finance treated the funds collected as part of the general revenue and never spent the money for its intended purpose. Expenditure on education was only 1.4 to 3% of the gross national product between 1968 and 1974, compared with 2.5 to 6% for other African countries during the same period. Under the pressure of growing public dissatisfaction and mounting student activism in the university and secondary schools, the imperial government initiated a comprehensive study of the education system. Completed in July 1972, the Education Sector Review recommended attaining universal primary education as quickly and inexpensively as possible, ruralizing the curricula through the inclusion of informal training, equalizing educational opportunities, and relating the entire system to the national development process. The ESR criticized the education system's focus on preparing students for the next level of academic study and on the completion of rigid qualifying examinations. Also criticized was the government's lack of concern for the young people who dropped out before learning marketable skills, a situation that contributed to unemployment. The report stated that, by contrast, The recommended system would provide a self-contained program at each level that would be terminal for most students. The report was not published until February 1974, which gave time for rumors to generate opposition among students, parents, and the teachers' union to the ESR recommendations. Most resented what they considered the removal of education from its elite position. Many teachers also feared salary reductions. Strikes and widespread disturbances ensued, and the education crisis became a contributing factor in the imperial regime's fall later that year. With the beginning of the Ethiopian Revolution in 1974, the name of the university was changed to Addis Ababa University. By 1974, despite efforts by the government to improve the situation, less than 10% of the total population was literate. The National Literacy Campaign began in early 1975 when the government mobilized more than 60,000 students and teachers, sending them all over the country for 2-year terms of service. Most critics, however, saw this as the government's way to silence rising opposition while at the same time creating a network of government spies in the rural areas. Generally, the campaign to increase literacy remained elusive even though government reports showed improvements. Under the Derg regime, Marxist-Leninist philosophy was the guiding theme for all government systems. One of the first policy changes was the right of every citizen to free primary education. The educational system was geared to attainment of communist ideology. Eastern European governments provided policy advisors to develop a curriculum based on their systems. The general idea was education for the masses and could be summarized in the slogans, education for production, for research and for political consciousness. The Derg's proclamation No. 103 had public ownership of schools consistent with the socialist system. This still left a few private schools for children of politicians and wealthy families, resulting in a higher quality of education for these children than for all others. Primary schooling expanded throughout the country with national enrollment reaching 34.1%. There were still regional disparities with more resources going to the south than to the north. Educational quality decreased with expansion largely due to resource scarcity. The Derg tried to resolve the problem of teacher shortage by recruiting 5,500 untrained teachers from those who had completed grade 12. These teachers had to attend government-designed summer schools for 3 years to obtain certification. Throughout the Derg regime, civil war, severe drought and famine had a negative effect on educational improvements that had been achieved. By 1991, when the Derg was overthrown by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, infrastructure had been destroyed. There was little access to education and extreme poverty was widespread. Since this time, the EPRDF has gradually improved the educational sector leading up to the current system.